Police sergeant vanished in 1986. 25 years later, a retired K-9 unit made a shocking find. In 1986, a decorated police sergeant left for his morning shift in a quiet coastal town and never came home. No body, no witnesses, no explanation. Just an empty patrol car found at the station and 25 years of silence that would haunt an entire community. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. The morning of March 14, 1986, started like any other in the small fishing village that hugged the northeastern coast. Salt air mixed with the smell of diesel fuel from the boats returning with their overnight catches. Gulls cried overhead, their voices echoing off weathered wooden docks that had stood for generations. The Portuguese fishing community was already awake, mending nets and preparing for another day on the Atlantic waters that had sustained their families for decades. Sergeant Michael Torres kissed his wife goodbye at 6:47 a.m., just as he had done for the past 15 years. His daughter Margaret, then in her mid-20s, had moved to the city 2 years earlier, chasing a corporate career that felt worlds away from this tight-knit town where everyone knew everyone's secrets, or thought they did. Margaret's mother, Elena, watched from the kitchen window as Michael's cruiser pulled out of their driveway, the taillights disappearing into the early morning fog that rolled in from the ocean like a living thing. Michael Torres wasn't just any cop. He was the kind of officer who knew every kid's name, who'd helped old Mrs. Santos find her cat 3 times in 1 month, who mediated disputes between fishermen without ever filing paperwork. His record was spotless. His dedication was legendary. People trusted him not just because of the badge, but because of the man behind it. His shift was supposed to end at 3 p.m. By 3:30, Elena felt the first flutter of worry in her chest. By 4:00, she called the station. By 5:00, every officer in the department was searching. His patrol car sat in its usual spot at the station, keys in the ignition, logbook open to his last entry at 2:47 p.m. Routine patrol complete. Heading in. But Michael Torres had never made it inside. Somewhere between the parking lot and the station door, a distance of maybe 50 feet, he had vanished into thin air. The investigation that followed turned up nothing. No signs of struggle. No evidence of foul play. No financial problems that might suggest he'd run away. His weapon was found locked in his vehicle, his wallet untouched. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed him whole, leaving behind only questions that grew heavier with each passing day. The coastal town that prided itself on transparency and community trust found itself drowning in whispers and speculation. Some said he'd been having an affair. Others claimed he'd witnessed something he shouldn't have. A few even suggested the ocean had called him, a fisherman's son who'd chosen the badge over the nets, but never truly left the sea behind. Elena Torres kept every light in their house burning that first night, certain he would find his way home. She would keep those lights burning for 25 years, creating a beacon of hope that slowly transformed into a shrine of denial. But what really happened during those final moments of Michael Torres's shift? And why would it take a quarter of a century and a retired police dog's keen nose to begin unraveling the truth? The first 48 hours after a disappearance are critical. Everyone in law enforcement knows this. But when one of your own vanishes without a trace, those hours feel like seconds slipping through desperate fingers. Detective Vincent Romano was Michael's partner, his closest friend on the force, and the last person to see him alive. Vincent had shared coffee with Michael that morning in the station break room, the bitter taste of cheap police station brew mixed with casual conversation about weekend fishing plans. Now, less than 12 hours later, Vincent stood in that same break room, his hands shaking as he poured himself another cup he wouldn't drink, trying to make sense of the impossible. He mentioned nothing unusual, Vincent told the state investigators who arrived within hours of the report. Just routine stuff. We talked about the Celtics game, his daughter's new job in the city, the usual. But Vincent's eyes betrayed something else, a flicker of memory he couldn't quite grasp, like trying to remember a dream after waking. The state police treated it like any other missing person case at first. They canvassed the area, interviewed everyone who'd seen Michael that day. The owner of the corner deli remembered him buying his regular turkey sandwich at noon. The clerk at the post office confirmed he'd mailed a letter around 1:30 p.m., addressed to Margaret in the city. That letter would arrive 2 days later, containing nothing but a father's routine check-in. Hope work is treating you well. Mom sends her love. Come visit soon. Nothing in that letter suggested a man planning to disappear. Nothing suggested anything at all. The coastal town transformed overnight. The same neighbors who'd gathered for summer barbecues and Christmas parties now eyed each other with suspicion. In a community where doors were rarely locked and trust was currency, Michael's disappearance fractured something fundamental. Portuguese fishermen who'd known the Torres family for 3 generations whispered in their native language during morning coffee, words heavy with confusion and fear. Elena Torres became a ghost in her own home. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. She sat by the window overlooking the driveway, waiting for headlights that never came. Friends brought casseroles she never touched. Her sister moved in to help, but there was no helping someone whose entire world had collapsed in the space between one breath and the next. Margaret received the news over a crackling phone line in her tiny Boston apartment. She'd been reviewing quarterly reports when her mother's voice, hollow and broken, shattered her concentration forever. "Your father." Elena couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Margaret was on the road within an hour. Her corporate life abandoned mid-presentation. The 3-hour drive back to her childhood home felt both endless and far too short. What do you say to a mother whose husband has vanished? How do you comfort someone when you're drowning in your own panic? The town she returned to wasn't the one she'd left. It felt smaller, darker, suffocating under the weight of unanswered questions. Everywhere she looked, she saw her father, his favorite bench overlooking the harbor, the diner where he took his morning coffee, the park where he'd taught her to ride a bike. He was everywhere and nowhere, a presence and an absence that made her chest tight with grief and confusion. The police had theories. They always do. Maybe he'd suffered some kind of mental break. Maybe he'd gotten mixed up in something he couldn't handle. Maybe. Each theory felt like a betrayal, like they were rewriting who Michael Torres was to fit a narrative that made his disappearance make sense. But some disappearances don't make sense. Some mysteries refuse to be solved with logic and procedure. And sometimes, the truth is stranger and more painful than anyone could imagine. What the investigators didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Michael Torres hadn't left his last shift by choice. And the secret he'd been carrying was about to tear this peaceful coastal town apart from the inside out. 3 weeks after Michael Torres disappeared, the investigation hit its first major wall. Not because of lack of effort. The state police had conducted over 200 interviews, searched every inch of coastline, dredged portions of the harbor. The wall they hit was something far more frustrating: the complete absence of evidence. It was as if Michael Torres had simply ceased to exist at 2:47 p.m. on March 14, 1986. The K-9 units had been brought in during week 1. German shepherds trained to track scents followed Michael's trail from his patrol car to the station entrance, then stopped. Just stopped. The dogs circled, confused, unable to pick up any trace beyond that point. It was the handler, a quiet man named Thomas Brennan, who first voiced what everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say, "It's like he evaporated." Thomas would remember those words for the rest of his life. His dog, Max, a Belgian Malinois with an impressive track record, had never failed to find a trail before. The frustration in Max's behavior, the whining, the repeated circling, haunted Thomas. Dogs don't lie. They don't make mistakes. If Max couldn't find a scent, there was no scent to find. Margaret threw herself into the investigation with the same intensity she'd once reserved for corporate reports. She created timelines, interviewed her father's friends herself, retraced his route from that final shift. Her mother had become catatonic with grief, so Margaret became the family's voice, the one who pushed investigators when they seemed ready to move on to fresher cases. But the Portuguese fishing community had its own ideas about what happened. In the dim corners of local bars, over glasses of Vinho Verde, the old-timers spoke in hushed tones. Some remembered that Michael had been asking questions recently. Questions about town finances, about where certain grant money had gone, about discrepancies in the Coastal Preservation Fund that everyone in the fishing community had contributed to. He was too honest for his own good, one elderly fisherman told his companions, his weathered hands wrapped around a glass. In a small town, sometimes honesty is dangerous. Vincent Romano heard these whispers. As Michael's partner, he knew things the state police couldn't know. He knew Michael had been troubled in the weeks before his disappearance. He knew Michael had stayed late at the station, going through files, making phone calls he didn't discuss. Vincent had asked once, concerned, and Michael had smiled that reassuring smile and said, "Just tying up loose ends on an old case." But what case? Vincent had searched through every file Michael had touched. Nothing stood out. Nothing seemed significant enough to warrant the late nights and furrowed brow, unless Michael had been investigating something off the books, something he didn't want anyone, even his partner, to know about. The town council held a memorial service 4 weeks after the disappearance. Not a funeral. Elena refused to accept that her husband was dead, but a service to honor his years of service. The turnout was massive. People from neighboring towns came to pay respects. The mayor gave a moving speech about Michael's dedication and sacrifice. Margaret watched from the front row, her jaw tight with anger. Sacrifice? Her father hadn't sacrificed anything. He'd been taken, or he'd run, or something had happened that nobody was willing to admit. The word sacrifice suggested nobility, choice. Her father had been robbed of choice. After the service, as people milled around the church hall eating finger sandwiches and speaking in somber tones, Margaret noticed something odd. Several town council members stood in a tight cluster near the exit, their voices low, their expressions not quite matching the solemnity of the occasion. They looked nervous, guilty even. When she approached, trying to hear what they were discussing, they scattered like startled birds. That night, Margaret sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by memories of a simpler time. She opened her father's letter, the last one he'd ever sent her, and read it again, searching for hidden meanings in routine words. "Hope work is treating you well. Mom sends her love. Come visit soon. Come visit soon." Had that been a warning? A plea? Or just the ordinary request of a father who missed his daughter? Margaret didn't know, but she was beginning to suspect that her father's disappearance wasn't random. It wasn't a mental breakdown or a secret affair or a spontaneous decision to abandon his life. Someone had wanted Michael Torres gone, and in a town this small, where everyone knew everyone's business, that someone was probably sitting in church that morning, eating finger sandwiches and pretending to mourn. 2 months after Michael Torres vanished, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going back to Boston. Her corporate job, her apartment, her carefully constructed life in the city, all of it felt meaningless compared to finding out what happened to her father. Elena barely noticed when Margaret announced she was staying. Her mother had retreated so far into herself that some days she didn't speak at all, just sat by that window, watching, waiting, hope bleeding out a little more with each sunset. Margaret began where any good investigator begins, with the paperwork. She obtained copies of her father's bank records, his credit card statements, his phone bills. Nothing unusual, no large withdrawals, no mysterious charges, no calls to unfamiliar numbers. Michael Torres had been exactly who he appeared to be. A small-town cop living within his means, devoted to his family and his work. But then Margaret found the notebook, It was hidden in the garage, tucked inside a toolbox that her father rarely used. The notebook was small, the kind you could slip into a jacket pocket, and it was filled with Michael's careful handwriting. Dates, names, dollar amounts, and one phrase that appeared repeatedly: Coastal Preservation Fund. Discrepancies. Margaret's hands trembled as she read. Her father had been tracking money. Grant money that was supposed to go toward protecting the coastline, maintaining the docks, supporting the fishing industry that had sustained this town for generations. Thousands of dollars that had simply disappeared from the official records. The names in the notebook made her stomach drop. Town council members, the mayor, even the town treasurer, a woman who'd been friends with Margaret's mother since childhood. People she'd known her entire life. People who'd brought casseroles after her father disappeared, who'd hugged her at the memorial service, who'd looked her in the eye and said they'd do anything to help. But why would her father investigate this alone? Why not go through proper channels? The answer came 2 days later when Margaret visited Vincent Romano at his home. Vincent had aged a decade in 2 months, his face gaunt, his eyes shadowed with guilt and sleepless nights. When Margaret showed him the notebook, Vincent's reaction told her everything she needed to know. "He came to me," Vincent said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sue, about 6 weeks before he disappeared. He showed me some preliminary findings, asked my advice." Vincent's hands shook as he poured himself a drink he clearly needed. "Ansiji, I told him to be careful. I told him to work through official channels, to not make waves. This town, Margaret, you have to understand. These people aren't criminals. They're our neighbors. Some of them took that money because their businesses were failing, because their families needed help during the recession. So you told him to let it go." Margaret's voice was ice. "I told him to handle it quietly." Vincent's anguish was palpable. "I thought if we could resolve it internally, without scandal, without destroying people's reputations, I thought I was protecting everyone, including your father." But Vincent's advice had done the opposite. By telling Michael to work quietly, he'd forced him to investigate alone, to gather evidence without backup, to become vulnerable in ways that a public investigation would have prevented. Margaret left Vincent's house with more questions than answers. If her father had been gathering evidence, where was it? The notebook only showed preliminary findings. Where was the proof? The documents? The smoking gun that would show exactly where the money had gone and who was responsible? That night, Margaret broke into the municipal building. It wasn't really breaking in. She still had keys from her summer job there in high school. And amazingly, the locks hadn't been changed in 15 years. The building was dark, silent, except for the hum of old fluorescent lights she didn't dare turn on. She used a flashlight, moving through hallways she knew by heart, heading toward the records room. The filing cabinets were old, poorly organized, perfect for hiding discrepancies. Margaret worked methodically, pulling folders, photographing documents with a camera she'd borrowed. Hours passed. Her back ached, her eyes burned. But she kept going because this was the closest she'd felt to her father since he'd disappeared. And then she found it, a folder that shouldn't exist, buried in the back of a cabinet marked Archived, 1983-1985. Inside were photocopies of checks, transfer records, meeting minutes that had never made it into the official town records, evidence of systematic misappropriation of funds spanning 3 years, evidence that someone had clearly wanted to keep hidden. Margaret's heart pounded as she photographed every page. This was what her father had found. This was why he'd disappeared. But as she prepared to leave, a sound froze her in place. The front door of the building opening, footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, moving toward the records room where she stood, trapped, with evidence that had already cost her father everything. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The footsteps were getting closer, steady and deliberate, echoing off the marble floors of the municipal building. She killed her flashlight and pressed herself against the filing cabinet, her heart hammering so hard she was certain whoever was coming could hear it. The door to the records room swung open. A beam of light swept across the room, and Margaret recognized the voice immediately. "Sidri, I know you're in here, Margaret." It was Thomas Brennan, the K-9 handler who'd searched for her father 2 months ago. But what was he doing here in the middle of the night? Margaret stepped out from behind the cabinet, her flashlight aimed at him like a weapon, though they both knew it was useless. "You followed me." "No," Thomas said, lowering his own flashlight. In the dim light, his face looked older, haggard. "I've been coming here every few weeks since your father disappeared, looking for the same thing you are." The admission hung in the air between them. Margaret's mind raced. Why? Thomas moved further into the room, and Margaret noticed he was carrying a worn leather satchel. "Because I was the last person to see your father that day. Not Vincent in the break room, me, in the parking lot, right before he vanished." His voice cracked. "He told me something, Margaret, something I didn't understand until it was too late." Margaret's hands trembled. "What did he say?" "He said, if anything happens to me, check the Preservation Fund records. Follow the money to the real estate deals." Thomas set his satchel on the table, pulling out files Margaret had never seen. Your father wasn't just tracking stolen grant money. He'd discovered that several council members were using those funds to purchase coastal property through shell companies, then selling it to developers at massive profits. The scale of it hit Margaret like a physical blow. This wasn't just embezzlement. It was organized fraud that betrayed the entire fishing community that had built this town. The Preservation Fund had been created to protect their way of life, and instead, it had been used to destroy it. "Why didn't you tell the investigators?" Margaret's voice was sharp. "Because I didn't have proof." Thomas's anguish was raw. "Your father never told me where he kept his evidence. I've been searching for months, terrified that if I told anyone what he said, I'd end up like him, vanished, with no one to continue the investigation." Margaret showed him the folder she'd found. Thomas's eyes widened as he flipped through the photocopied documents. "This is it. This is what he found?" But then his expression darkened. "Margaret, if you have this, they'll know someone was here. These people, they've already made your father disappear. They won't hesitate to—" A sound from the hallway cut him off. More footsteps, multiple people this time. Voices, the unmistakable jingle of keys. "The security guard," Thomas whispered urgently. "They must have seen your car outside." But it wasn't just the security guard. As the footsteps grew closer, Margaret recognized one of the voices. The mayor's distinctive baritone, smooth and politician-perfect even at 2 a.m. And he wasn't alone. Thomas grabbed Margaret's arm. "There's a back exit through the basement. Your father showed it to me once. We have to go now." They ran, Margaret clutching the folder and her camera, Thomas leading the way through darkened hallways that felt like a maze. Behind them, shouts echoed. They'd been spotted. The chase was on. They burst through the basement exit into the cold night air, the smell of salt and seaweed overwhelming after the musty building. Thomas's truck was parked 2 blocks away. They sprinted through alleys Margaret had played in as a child, alleys that now felt menacing and unfamiliar. As they reached Thomas's truck and peeled away into the night, Margaret looked back at the municipal building. Silhouettes stood in the doorway, watching them escape. She couldn't make out faces, but she didn't need to. The message was clear. They knew she'd found the evidence, and just like her father, she'd become a threat that needed to be eliminated. But unlike her father, Margaret wasn't alone anymore, and she wasn't going to disappear quietly into the night. Thomas drove for 30 minutes before speaking, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. Max, his Belgian Malinois, sat alert in the back seat, sensing his handler's tension. The dog hadn't made a sound, but his eyes never left the road behind them. "Where are we going?" Margaret finally asked, clutching the folder like a lifeline. "Somewhere they won't think to look." Thomas turned onto a narrow dirt road that wound through dense pine forest. "An old hunting cabin my grandfather built. It's not on any official records." The cabin emerged from the trees like something from another era. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, windows dark and dusty. But inside, after Thomas lit a kerosene lamp, Margaret saw it was surprisingly well maintained. A wood stove, canned goods, a pump for well water. A place someone could hide for a long time if they needed to. "You've been preparing for this," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, his face haggard in the lamplight. "Since the day your father disappeared, I've known something was wrong. The way the investigation was handled, the way certain people pushed to close the case quickly, the way evidence seemed to just vanish." He sank into a chair, suddenly looking much older than his 42 years. "I couldn't prove anything, but I knew, and I knew that if I ever found proof, I'd need somewhere safe to regroup." Margaret spread the documents across a worn wooden table. In the lamplight, the evidence of corruption looked even more damning. Transfer records showing money flowing from the Coastal Preservation Fund into accounts belonging to companies with names like Seabreeze Holdings LLC and Atlantic Properties Group. Property deeds showing these same companies buying prime coastal land for pennies on the dollar, then selling to developers for hundreds of thousands. "Look at the dates," Thomas said, pointing to a cluster of transactions. "These all happened in the 6 months before your father disappeared." He must have noticed the pattern. But it was another document that made Margaret's blood run cold. Meeting minutes from a closed town council session, dated March 10th, 1986, 4 days before her father vanished. The minutes were brief, clinical. Discussion of security concerns. Motion to address potential exposure. Unanimous approval to proceed with containment measures. Containment measures. "They knew," Margaret whispered. "They knew my father was investigating them, and they voted on how to stop him." The implications crashed over her like a wave. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. It was premeditated, organized, a town council voting unanimously to contain a threat to their illegal operation. Her father hadn't simply disappeared, he'd been systematically eliminated. Thomas was staring at another document, his face pale. "Margaret, look at this signature." It was Vincent Romano's signature, dated March 11th, 1 day after the meeting, 3 days before the disappearance. A memo stating that Sergeant Torres would be conducting routine solo patrol on March 14th, deviating from normal partner protocol. Vincent, her father's best friend and partner, had signed off on sending him out alone. Had he known what would happen? Or had he been manipulated, used to isolate Michael without understanding the consequences? A sound outside made them both freeze. Max's ears perked up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Thomas grabbed a flashlight and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. "Headlights," he said quietly. "About a quarter mile down the road. Coming this way." Margaret's heart dropped. "How did they find us?" Thomas's face was grim as he turned to her. "Either we were followed more carefully than I thought, or—" He paused, the terrible realization dawning. "Or someone else knew about this cabin. Someone I trusted with the location years ago." The betrayal ran deeper than either of them had imagined. And now, trapped in a cabin with no phone and limited options, Margaret understood exactly how her father must have felt in his final moments, surrounded by people he'd trusted, realizing too late that trust itself had become a weapon. The headlights cut through the darkness like predator eyes, growing brighter with each passing second. Thomas grabbed the evidence folder and shoved it into his satchel, while Margaret extinguished the kerosene lamp, plunging them into darkness. Max stood rigid, his training overriding his instinct to bark. "Back door," Thomas whispered. "Through the kitchen. We can make it to the tree line before—" The vehicle stopped, but the engine didn't cut off immediately. One door opened, then closed with a soft thunk. Footsteps on gravel, slow and measured. A single person, not a team. Margaret's breath came in shallow gasps as they crept toward the kitchen exit. Then a voice called out, "Thomas? Thomas Brennan, I know you're in there. It's Vincent. We need to talk." Margaret froze. Vincent Romano, the partner who'd signed her father's death warrant, whether intentionally or not. Thomas's hand found her arm in the darkness, his grip a warning to stay quiet, stay hidden. "I'm alone," Vincent continued, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion. "And if I wanted to bring them here, I would have done it hours ago. I've been following you since you left the municipal building, making sure no one else did." Thomas exchanged a glance with Margaret in the darkness. It could be a trap. Vincent had already betrayed her father once, even if unintentionally. But something in his voice, the rawness, the defeat, made Margaret make a decision that might save them or doom them. "Let him in," she said. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. He opened the cabin door, and Vincent stepped into the darkness, alone as promised. In the faint moonlight, Margaret could see the toll the past months had taken. Vincent looked like a ghost of himself, hollow-eyed and haunted. Thomas relit the lamp. Vincent's eyes immediately found the documents spread on the table, and something inside him seemed to break. He sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. "I didn't know," he said, his voice muffled. "I swear to God, Margaret, I didn't know what they were planning." He looked up, tears streaming down his weathered face. "When Michael came to me with his concerns, I thought I was protecting everyone by telling him to be discreet. I thought we could handle it internally, quietly. I never imagined," his voice broke. "But you signed the memo," Margaret said, her voice hard despite the pity stirring in her chest. "You sent him out alone that day." "Because the mayor told me it was routine." Vincent's anguish was palpable. He said Michael had requested solo patrol to follow up on some traffic complaints. "It didn't seem unusual. Michael did that sometimes. I signed it without thinking." He pulled out a cigarette with shaking hands. "I didn't realize until weeks later, when I was going through files, that I'd never seen Michael's actual request. I'd only seen the memo I signed, authorizing it." "They forged his request," Thomas said slowly, the pieces clicking into place. Vincent nodded. "They used me to isolate him. They knew I was his partner, that I'd sign off without questioning it. And by the time I understood what I'd done..." He looked at Margaret with eyes full of guilt and grief. "I was too afraid to come forward. Afraid of what they'd do to me, to my family. I'm a coward, Margaret. I let them get away with what they did to your father, because I was too much of a coward to speak up." The cabin fell silent, except for the hiss of the kerosene lamp and Vincent's ragged breathing. Margaret stared at the man who'd been like an uncle to her growing up, who'd taught her how to fish, who'd celebrated every birthday and holiday at their dinner table, the man who'd failed her father when it mattered most. "So why are you here now?" Margaret asked. Vincent reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "Because 3 weeks ago I received this in my mailbox. No return address, no postmark, just my name written in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere." He placed the envelope on the table. The handwriting was unmistakable, Michael Torres's distinctive script. "It's impossible," Margaret whispered. "He disappeared 2 months ago." "I know," Vincent said. "But either your father is still alive somewhere, or someone wants us to think he is. Either way, what's inside this envelope changes everything we thought we knew about the day Michael Torres vanished." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. The paper felt real, solid, not some phantom conjured from desperation and grief. Her father's handwriting stared back at her, the distinctive way he crossed his T's, the slight leftward slant he'd never been able to correct despite years of practice. "Open it," Thomas urged quietly. The seal broke with a soft tear that sounded deafening in the cabin's silence. Inside was a single sheet of paper, filled with her father's careful script, and a small brass key taped to the bottom. Margaret read aloud, her voice shaking. The cabin fell silent. Margaret read the letter again, then a third time, trying to absorb the magnitude of what her father had uncovered. This wasn't just a local scandal, it was organized crime operating under the cover of municipal government. "Portland is 3 hours from here," Thomas said finally. We could drive there tonight, get to the bank when it opens. But Vincent was shaking his head, his face ashen. You don't understand. Sarah Chen, the state investigator Michael mentions, she died 6 weeks after Michael disappeared. Car accident on Route 1, single vehicle collision, no witnesses. The report said she fell asleep at the wheel. The implication hung heavy in the air. 2 investigators both gone. The conspiracy had reached beyond their small coastal town, into the state government itself. How far does this go? Margaret whispered. How many people are involved? Vincent pulled out a crumpled newspaper clipping from his wallet, something he'd clearly been carrying for weeks. It showed Sarah Chen's obituary, her official photo. A sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s who looked like someone who didn't miss details. Before she died, Vincent said, Sarah came to see me. She told me that if anything happened to Michael, I needed to be very careful who I trusted. She said the development consortium had connections everywhere. Local police, state officials, even some federal agencies. She said the only way to bring them down was to gather enough evidence that they couldn't suppress it all at once. Margaret looked at the key in her hand. Whatever was in that safe deposit box could bring down an entire criminal network. But it could also get them all killed. There's something else, Vincent said, his voice barely audible. The envelope, it arrived 3 weeks ago. But according to the bank records I checked, that safe deposit box under John Morrison's name, it was opened 6 days ago. Someone's already been there. The question that haunted them all was terrifying. If someone already accessed the box, was the evidence gone? Or had Michael Torres somehow impossibly been the one to open it? They left the cabin before dawn, the forest still wrapped in darkness and mist that clung to the pine trees like ghosts. Thomas drove, while Margaret sat in the passenger seat. The brass key clutched so tightly in her hand that it left an imprint in her palm. Vincent followed in his own car, keeping a careful distance. 3 vehicles were harder to track than 2. Max sensed the tension, his ears alert, occasionally whining softly from the back seat. Dogs always know when something's wrong, and everything about this early morning drive screamed danger. The 3-hour journey to Portland felt eternal. Margaret watched the coastal landscape roll by. Rocky shores giving way to sandy beaches, small fishing villages transforming into suburban sprawl. Each mile felt like moving deeper into territory where the conspiracy's reach might be stronger, where allies were fewer and enemies wore familiar faces. What if the box is empty? Margaret finally asked, voicing the fear they'd all been carrying since the cabin. Thomas's jaw tightened. Then we find another way. Your father was thorough. If the primary evidence is gone, he would have had a backup plan. But would he? Margaret thought. Her father had been one man against an entire criminal network. How many backup plans could he have created before they caught up with him? First National Bank stood in downtown Portland, an imposing granite building that had survived nearly a century of New England weather. The lobby smelled of old wood and new money, marble floors echoing with the footsteps of early morning customers. Margaret felt exposed, vulnerable, certain that every security camera was tracking them, that every teller knew exactly why they were there. The safe deposit box clerk was a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a chain and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything and was impressed by nothing. Margaret showed her the key and provided the name John Morrison with a confidence she didn't feel. Identification? The clerk asked, bored. This was the moment that could unravel everything. They had the key, but no ID for the fictitious John Morrison. Margaret's heart sank. They'd driven 3 hours only to be stopped by bureaucracy. But Vincent stepped forward, pulling out a driver's license that made Margaret's blood freeze. It was her father's license, but the name read John Morrison, and the address was a Portland P.O. box. Her father had created an entire false identity, complete with documentation. "Where did you get that?" Margaret whispered. "Your father gave it to me 2 weeks before he disappeared," Vincent said quietly. "He told me to keep it safe, that I might need it someday." I didn't understand then. I do now. The clerk barely glanced at the ID before leading them to the vault. The walk through the bank's interior felt like descending into a tomb. Cold, silent, heavy with secrets. The clerk opened the gate, located box 237, and used both keys to open it. "Take your time," she said, retreating to give them privacy. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled out the long metal box. It was heavier than expected, and the weight brought both hope and dread. Thomas and Vincent crowded close as she lifted the lid. Inside was a carefully organized archive. Thick manila folders, each labeled with dates and case numbers. Photographs, dozens of them, showing town council members meeting with men in expensive suits. Envelopes changing hands. Documents being signed. A cassette tape labeled March 12, 1986, Town Hall, Council Chambers. Financial ledgers showing money flowing through shell companies. And at the bottom, a second envelope, this one addressed simply to "My daughter." Margaret's vision blurred with tears. Her father had known. He'd known something might happen to him, and he'd left her a message, waiting in a bank vault for the day she'd finally find it. But before she could open it, Thomas grabbed her arm, his face pale. He was holding one of the photographs, and what it showed made Margaret's world tilt on its axis. The photo showed her father, alive and well, standing outside a diner. The date stamp on the bottom read April 3, 1986, 20 days after his disappearance. And he wasn't alone. Standing next to him, deep in conversation, was a woman Margaret had never seen before. "That's Sarah Chen," Vincent whispered, his voice hoarse. "The state investigator. This was taken after Michael supposedly vanished. After Sarah supposedly didn't know what happened to him." The implications crashed over them like a wave. Michael Torres hadn't been killed on March 14, 1986. He'd gone into hiding, working with Sarah Chen to build a case from the shadows. But if that was true, what had happened to him after this photo was taken? And why had Sarah Chen lied about knowing his whereabouts? At the bottom of the box, underneath all the evidence, was something that made Margaret's heart stop. A plane ticket stub to Florida, dated March 15, 1986, with a handwritten note attached. "I'm sorry. I had no choice. Protect your mother." Dad Michael Torres had run. He'd abandoned his family, his life, his identity, and fled across state lines. But was it cowardice? Or was it the only way to stay alive long enough to expose the truth? Margaret's hands trembled as she held the envelope addressed to her. The handwriting was so familiar it hurt. The same script that had written birthday cards and permission slips, that had left notes on the refrigerator about dinner in the oven, and "Don't forget your jacket." The handwriting of a father who'd read her bedtime stories and taught her to bait a fishing hook. The handwriting of a man who'd abandoned her. "Take your time," Thomas said gently, but Margaret could see the urgency in his eyes. They couldn't stay in this bank vault forever. Every minute they lingered was another minute for someone to notice them, to recognize Vincent, to make a phone call that would end with them disappearing just like her father had. She opened the envelope. The letter was dated March 13, 1986, one day before his disappearance. "Michael!" Margaret's tears fell onto the paper, smudging ink that had waited 2 months to deliver its devastating message. Her father hadn't been killed. He hadn't been kidnapped. He'd made a choice, an impossible, agonizing choice between justice and family, between duty and love. And her mother had known. All this time, Elena Torres had known her husband was alive, had received his letters, had protected his secret and his reputation, while the entire town whispered about abandonment and mystery. Vincent's voice broke through her grief. "Margaret, we need to—" He stopped mid-sentence. Through the narrow window of the vault door, they could see the bank lobby. 2 men in dark suits had entered, showing badges to the security guard. Not local police, federal badges. But were they legitimate federal agents? Or were they the conspiracy's answer to 3 people digging too deep into secrets that should have stayed buried? "Back exit," Thomas whispered urgently, shoving documents back into the safe deposit box. "Now!" But Vincent grabbed his arm. Wait, look at them more carefully. Through the narrow window, Margaret watched the two agents. One was tall, angular, with gray temples and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement. The other was younger, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes that scanned the lobby with practiced precision. They weren't acting like hired muscle. They were acting like actual investigators. "That's Agent Robert Chen," Vincent said, his voice barely audible. "Sarah Chen's father. I saw his photo in her obituary. He's FBI, Financial Crimes Division." The name Chen sent electricity through Margaret's body. Sarah's father. Was this revenge? Help? Or something more complicated? The decision had to be made in seconds. Run and lose any chance of federal protection, or stay and risk walking into a trap that had already killed 2 investigators. Margaret looked at the evidence spread before them. Her father's life work. The proof that could bring down an entire criminal network. "We stay," she decided. Thomas looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Margaret, my father ran, and it cost him everything. I'm not running." She gathered the most critical documents and photographs, stuffing them into her jacket. "But we keep some evidence on us, just in case." They emerged from the vault just as Agent Chen and his partner reached the safe deposit area. The older agent's eyes locked onto Vincent immediately, recognition flashing across his weathered face. "Detective Romano," Agent Chen said, his voice carrying decades of authority. "We've been looking for you, and you must be Margaret Torres." The use of her real name, the acknowledgement of Vincent's identity, it was either legitimate or a very sophisticated trap. "How did you find us?" Margaret asked, her hand instinctively moving toward the evidence hidden in her jacket. "We didn't," the younger agent said. "We've had the John Morrison safe deposit box flagged for 2 years, waiting for someone to access it. When the alert came through this morning, we hoped it would be you." Agent Chen's expression was granite and grief combined. "My daughter died investigating the same corruption your father discovered, Miss Torres. She told me everything before she went after them. She told me about Michael's contingency plans, about the safe deposit box, about the evidence he'd been gathering." "If you knew about the evidence, why wait 2 years?" Thomas challenged, his hand resting protectively on Max's head. "Because we needed someone outside the system to retrieve it," the younger agent explained. "Someone the conspiracy wouldn't see coming. The Portland field office is compromised. Hell, half the state attorney's office is on their payroll. We've been building a parallel investigation, but we needed the original evidence to make the case airtight." Agent Chen's eyes hardened. "My daughter died in a car accident that wasn't an accident. The brake lines were cut, the investigation was rushed, and the case was closed before I could even request a proper autopsy. These people have reach, Miss Torres. They have resources, and they don't leave witnesses." Margaret wanted to believe him, but her father had trusted the wrong people, and it had cost him his life. Or at least the life he'd known. "Prove it," she said. "Prove you're legitimate, and not just another part of the conspiracy." Agent Chen reached into his jacket slowly, pulling out a worn photograph. It showed Sarah Chen standing next to Michael Torres outside that same diner from the evidence photo. But this copy had writing on the back in Sarah Chen's handwriting, "Dad, if anything happens to me, trust Michael Torres's daughter. She'll finish what we started." Sarah? Margaret's breath caught. Her father and Sarah had planned for this moment, had anticipated that someday she would be standing exactly where she was now, choosing whether to trust or run. "Your father is alive," Agent Chen said quietly. "He's been in witness protection for 2 years, waiting for the day when we'd have enough evidence to bring these people down. He didn't just run to Florida and hide, Miss Torres. He's been working with us, gathering evidence, preparing for the moment when we could finally make arrests that would stick." The vault room spun around Margaret. Her father was alive, not just surviving, but fighting. All this time, while her mother had maintained her silent vigil, while Margaret had believed her father was either dead or a coward, he'd been working to bring down the conspiracy that had stolen his life. "Where is he?" Margaret's voice cracked. "I need to see him." Agent Chen's expression softened with something like sympathy. "That's not possible yet. Not until we have everyone in custody. The moment they know Michael Torres is alive and talking, they'll scatter. We get one shot at this." "How long?" Margaret demanded. 72 hours, the younger agent said. "We've been building cases against everyone involved. Local officials, state senators, the development consortium executives. But we need your father's original evidence to make the charges stick. Bank records can be explained away. Photographs can be dismissed. But a decorated police sergeant's first-hand account, backed by meticulous documentation, that's unbeatable." Margaret looked at Vincent, at Thomas, at the evidence that had cost so many people so much. Her father had spent 2 years in hiding, working toward this moment. Her mother had spent 2 years keeping secrets to protect this operation. And now it all came down to whether Margaret could trust 2 federal agents she'd just met. But sometimes trust isn't about certainty. Sometimes it's about taking a leap of faith that your father's sacrifice meant something. 72 hours, Margaret said, handing over the documents. Then I see my father. And then this conspiracy burns to the ground. 72 hours can feel like a lifetime when you're waiting for the world to change. The FBI moved Margaret, Vincent, and Thomas to a safe house outside Portland, a nondescript ranch home in a quiet suburban neighborhood where soccer moms walked dogs and children played in sprinklers. It was the kind of place where no one would think to look for people hiding from a multi-state criminal conspiracy. Agent Chen assigned 2 marshals to guard them around the clock. Through the windows, Margaret could see ordinary life continuing. Mail carriers delivering packages, teenagers washing cars, an elderly couple tending their garden. The normalcy felt surreal, almost obscene, when she knew that somewhere her father was alive, breathing the same air, existing in the same world after 2 years of believing him dead. The first 24 hours were the hardest. Margaret couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't do anything but pace the safe house's small living room while Max watched her with concerned, dark eyes. Thomas tried to offer comfort, but what comfort was there? Her father was alive. Her mother had known. Every assumption Margaret had built her grief upon was a lie, constructed to protect a larger truth. "Your mother did what she had to do," Vincent said on the second day, watching Margaret stare at her untouched coffee. "Keeping that secret kept you safe. If you'd known your father was alive, you might have tried to find him, and that would have led them straight to him." "She let me think he'd abandoned us," Margaret said, her voice hollow. "Do you know what that does to someone? Wondering every day if your father loved you enough to stay." Vincent had no answer. There was no good answer. Elena Torres had made an impossible choice between truth and safety, and both options carried unbearable costs. Agent Chen visited on hour 48, bringing updates that felt simultaneously too much and not enough. "We've identified 73 individuals involved in the conspiracy across 5 states, he explained, spreading photographs across the dining room table. Town council members, state senators, real estate developers, even 2 federal employees who'd been feeding information to the consortium. We're coordinating with field offices across New England. The arrests will happen simultaneously, 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. We can't risk anyone tipping off the others." Margaret studied the photographs. Some faces she recognized from her childhood. Mr. Hendricks, who'd owned the hardware store, Mrs. Patterson, who'd taught her piano lessons, the mayor who'd given that moving speech at her father's memorial service. Ordinary people who'd committed extraordinary crimes in the name of profit. "What about my mother?" Margaret asked. "Does she know this is happening?" Agent Chen's expression softened. "She's known from the beginning. Your mother has been our liaison with your father for 2 years. Every letter she received from him contained encoded information about the investigation's progress. She's been part of this operation since day 1. The revelation struck Margaret like a physical blow. Her mother, grieving, silent Elena, who'd spent 2 years staring out windows, had been an undercover, Operative in her own home, every tear had been real, but so had her purpose. She'd played the role of abandoned wife so perfectly that even her own daughter had believed it. "Hour 60, Thomas announced, checking his watch. It had become a ritual, marking time like prisoners counting days until freedom. The younger FBI agent, who'd introduced herself as Agent Lisa Morrison, knocked before entering with dinner. Chinese takeout that none of them had appetite for, but would force themselves to eat. "It's going to work," she said, catching Margaret's expression. "Your father's evidence is solid. We've cross-referenced everything. These people are going down." But as night fell on the 67th hour, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her blood froze as she read the message. "We know where you are. We know what you gave them. You have one chance to make this right. Come alone to the old municipal building at midnight. Come alone, or your mother dies." Attached was a photograph. Elena Torres, bound to a chair in a dim room, fear stark in her eyes, and standing behind her with a hand on her shoulder was someone Margaret recognized. It was the town treasurer, the woman who'd been Elena's friend for 30 years, the woman who'd brought casseroles and comfort after Michael's disappearance, the woman whose name appeared 17 times in the evidence files as a key player in the conspiracy. They'd taken her mother, and they were demanding Margaret trade herself for Elena's life with less than 12 hours before the FBI raids were scheduled to begin. What they didn't know was that Margaret had already sacrificed too much to this conspiracy, and she was done running, done hiding, done letting other people pay for seeking justice. But could she really risk her mother's life to bring these people down? Or would she become like her father, making impossible choices that would haunt her forever? Agent Chen's response to the text was immediate and unequivocal. "Absolutely not. We don't negotiate with criminals. We move the timeline up and raid now." "My mother dies if we do that," Margaret said, her voice steel despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You said it yourself. These people don't leave witnesses. The moment they realize the FBI is coming, they'll kill her. And the moment you walk into that building, they'll kill you both," Agent Chen countered. "This is a trap, Miss Torres. They know the raids are coming. Someone leaked the timeline. This is their last desperate play." But Margaret was already formulating a plan, her analytical mind cutting through fear to find the angles, the possibilities. "So we give them what they expect. I go in alone, but I'm not really alone." Thomas understood first. "Wire her. Put a team in position. Let them think they're in control." "It's too risky," Agent Morrison protested. "These are cornered animals, desperate and dangerous." Margaret thought of her father, spending 2 years in hiding, building a case brick by brick. She thought of Sarah Chen, dying on a dark highway for getting too close to the truth. She thought of her mother, playing the grieving widow for 2 years to protect an investigation. "Risk is all we have left," Margaret said. 3 hours later, at 11:47 p.m., Margaret Torres walked alone toward the old municipal building. At least, she appeared alone. In reality, FBI tactical teams were positioned in buildings across the street, on rooftops, in unmarked vehicles. A wire taped to her chest transmitted every word, every sound. And in her pocket, a panic button that would bring a dozen armed agents crashing through doors. The building loomed before her, dark except for a single light burning in the second-floor council chambers, the same room where her father had likely discovered the evidence that destroyed his life, the same room where the council had voted on containment measures 2 months ago. The front door was unlocked. Margaret's footsteps echoed on marble floors as she climbed the stairs, each step feeling like walking toward her own execution. But fear had transformed into something else, a cold, focused determination that her father's sacrifice would mean something. The council chamber doors stood open. Inside, the scene was exactly as the photograph had shown. Elena Torres sat bound to a chair in the center of the room, her face bruised, terror in her eyes. Behind her stood the town treasurer, Eleanor Patterson, holding a small revolver with the casual familiarity of someone who'd done this before. But they weren't alone. Arrayed around the room like a grotesque parody of a council meeting sat 5 other conspirators. The mayor, 2 council members, the town clerk, and someone Margaret didn't immediately recognize until he stepped forward into the light. It was Vincent Romano. The betrayal hit Margaret like a punch to the stomach. Vincent, her father's partner. Vincent, who'd been helping them. Vincent, who'd provided the ID to access the safe deposit box and led them straight into the FBI's hands. "I'm sorry, Margaret," Vincent said, and he actually sounded like he meant it. "But you have to understand, they have my family, my children. They told me if I didn't bring them the evidence, if I didn't help them find out what Michael told the FBI..." His voice broke. "I had no choice." "Everyone has a choice," Margaret said, her voice surprisingly steady. The wire against her chest felt like a talisman, a reminder that she wasn't as alone as they thought. "My father made his choice. You made yours." Eleanor Patterson's laugh was bitter. "Your father made the smart choice. He took the money and ran. We let him live. We gave him a chance to disappear. But then he couldn't leave well enough alone, could he? He had to keep digging, keep investigating, work with that FBI bitch who stuck her nose where it didn't belong." "You killed Sarah Chen," Margaret said. Not a question, but an accusation. "Accidents happen," the mayor interjected smoothly, his politician's smile grotesque in the dim light. "Just like accidents will happen to you and your mother if you don't tell us exactly what you gave the FBI, and who else knows about it." Margaret's mother caught her eye, and despite the fear, despite the bruises, Elena Torres's expression carried a message. "Don't tell them anything. Hold on. The FBI has everything," Margaret said. "Documents, photographs, recorded conversations. You can kill me. You can kill my mother, but it won't stop what's coming." At 6 a.m., 73 people across 5 states are going to be arrested. It's over. Eleanor's gun swung toward Elena. "Then your mother dies first, and you watch." But before she could pull the trigger, 3 things happened simultaneously. Max, Thomas Brennan's Belgian Malinois, came through a second-floor window in an explosion of glass and snarling fury, trained to protect and attack on command. The FBI tactical team breached through multiple entrances, voices shouting, "FBI, hands up!" And Margaret's father, Michael Torres, alive, aged but unmistakable, burst through the council chamber doors, his own weapon drawn, his voice carrying the authority of 2 years of rage and determination. "It's over, Eleanor. All of you, it's over." The room erupted into chaos. Vincent tried to run and was tackled by federal agents. The mayor raised his hands, already calculating his legal defense. Eleanor's gun clattered to the floor as Max's jaws closed around her arm. And Margaret ran to her mother, cutting through the zip ties that bound her, both of them crying, both of them whole. Elena's arms wrapped around her daughter, and through her tears she whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry for every lie." Michael Torres stood in the doorway, watching his wife and daughter reunite, his own tears streaming down his face. He'd sacrificed 2 years, his identity, his life as he knew it. But his family was alive. The conspiracy was broken. And finally, the truth could come to light. The trials lasted 8 months. 73 individuals were charged with crimes ranging from embezzlement to racketeering, to conspiracy to commit murder. The courtrooms became theaters of revelation, each day's testimony peeling back another layer of corruption that had rotted through New England's coastal communities for over a decade. The mayor pleaded guilty in exchange for testimony against the Development Consortium executives. Eleanor Patterson refused to cooperate and received 25 years. Vincent Romano, whose coerced cooperation had nearly cost the Torres family everything, received immunity in exchange for his testimony, but his career in law enforcement was over. His reputation destroyed, his family relocated to escape the shame. Michael Torres spent 3 weeks on the witness stand. his testimony methodical, devastating, and absolutely unshakable. The defense attorneys tried to paint him as a deserter, a criminal who'd abandoned his family and fabricated evidence to cover his own misdeeds. But the paper trail was too solid, the documentation too thorough. Michael had spent 2 years building an airtight case, and now he was watching it bring down an empire built on stolen dreams. But the real story wasn't happening in the courtrooms. 3 days after the arrests, Margaret stood in her childhood home for the first time since discovering her father was alive. Elena was in the kitchen, cleaning compulsively, her way of processing trauma, of returning to normal routines that felt anything but normal. And Michael sat at the dining room table, older, grayer, a stranger wearing her father's face. "I know you can't forgive me," he said quietly, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug Elena had made him. The same mug he'd used every morning before his disappearance. Elena had kept it in the cupboard for 2 years, unable to use it or throw it away. "I wouldn't forgive me either." Margaret sat across from him, studying this man who'd given up everything to protect her. The anger she'd carried for 2 months, believing him either dead or a coward, had transformed into something more complex. Grief for the father she'd lost, gratitude for the sacrifice he'd made, resentment for the choice he'd never consulted her about. "You thought I couldn't handle the truth," Margaret said. "I thought the truth would get you killed," Michael corrected. "These people murdered a federal investigator, Margaret. They had no limits. If you'd known I was alive, if you'd come looking for me—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Elena brought coffee, her hands steady despite everything. She sat beside her husband, their fingers intertwining with the familiarity of 30 years of marriage. A marriage that had survived 2 years of enforced separation through coded letters and desperate hope. "You did what fathers do," Elena said softly. "You protected your family, even when it cost you everything." But Margaret wasn't ready to absolve him so easily. "You made a choice for me. You decided my safety was worth more than having a father, worth more than the truth. And maybe you were right. Maybe that was the only choice. But it was still a choice you made without asking me what I wanted." The words hung in the air like smoke. Michael's eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "You're right. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Forgiveness, Margaret was learning, wasn't a single moment. It was a process, a daily decision to choose love over anger, understanding over resentment. Her father had made impossible choices. So had her mother. So had she, in the end, walking into that municipal building, knowing she might not walk out. They were all survivors of the same conspiracy, all carrying scars that might never fully heal. Thomas Brennan visited a week later, Max trotting beside him with the pleased expression of a dog who'd been told he was a very good boy. And he had been. His attack on Eleanor Patterson had likely saved Elena's life, disrupting the situation long enough for the FBI to secure the room without casualties. "I'm leaving," Thomas said, standing on the Torres family's porch, the ocean visible in the distance. "This town? There's too many ghosts here. Too many memories of that day I couldn't find Michael's scent because there was no scent to find." Margaret understood. The town itself had become a crime scene, every street and building a reminder of corruption and betrayal. The fishing community was reeling, trying to understand how their elected officials had sold them out for profit. Trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. "Where will you go?" Margaret asked. "West, maybe? Somewhere Max and I can start fresh." He paused, then added, "Your father was the best man I ever knew. What he did, leaving, hiding, fighting from the shadows, took more courage than staying ever would have." 6 months after the arrests, Margaret stood before the town council, a new council, elected in emergency elections after every previous member was either indicted or resigned in disgrace. She'd prepared a statement, words she'd written and rewritten dozens of times. "My father, Sergeant Michael Torres, sacrificed his identity, his career, and 2 years of his life to expose corruption that betrayed this entire community. He did it knowing he might never be able to come home, knowing his reputation might be destroyed, knowing his family would suffer. He did it because he believed some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost is unbearable. She paused, looking out at the packed council chambers. Familiar faces. Neighbors who'd known her since childhood. Fishermen whose livelihoods had been threatened by the very conspiracy her father had exposed. I'm establishing a foundation in his name, the Michael Torres Justice Foundation. It will provide support for families of whistleblowers, offer legal resources for communities fighting corruption, and ensure that what happened here never happens again. My father paid too high a price for the truth. No one else should have to make the choice he made between justice and family. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes, but Margaret knew that no amount of applause could give her father back the 2 years he'd lost, couldn't erase the trauma her mother had endured, couldn't restore the innocence of a community that had learned their trusted leaders were thieves and criminals. A year after that midnight confrontation, Margaret sat on the porch of her parents' home, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of amber and gold. Her father sat beside her, quieter now, carrying the weight of his choices in the lines around his eyes and the gray in his hair that hadn't been there before. "Do you think it was worth it?" Margaret asked. "Everything you gave up?" Michael considered the question for a long moment. 73 people are in prison. Millions of dollars have been recovered and returned to the Preservation Fund. 3 coastal communities that were about to be destroyed by development have been saved. Dozens of families can keep their homes, their businesses, their way of life. He paused, then added quietly, "But I missed 2 years of your life. 2 years I can never get back. Was that trade worth it? I honestly don't know." That was the truth, Margaret realized. There were no clean answers, no clear victories. Justice had been served, but justice always demanded a price. Her father had paid it in years and identity. Her mother had paid it in secrets and sleepless nights. Margaret herself had paid it in innocence and trust. The coastal town recovered slowly, building new leadership, restoring faith brick by careful brick. The Torres family learned to be a family again, navigating the strange territory of reunion after trauma. Some days were good. Some days the ghosts felt too present, the losses too heavy. But they survived. And in surviving, they proved that even when corruption runs deep, even when the conspiracy seems untouchable, ordinary people can fight back. Sometimes at terrible cost. Sometimes sacrificing everything they hold dear. But always, always, the truth has power. Even when that power comes with a price too painful to calculate. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. What would you have done in Michael Torres's position? Would you have run to protect your family, or stayed to fight knowing it might destroy them? The answers aren't easy, and that's what makes this story haunt us long after it's over. Because in the end, the hardest mysteries aren't about who committed the crime. They're about what we're willing to sacrifice for justice, and whether that sacrifice was worth the price we paid.